Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I think we're all reading the headlines every day. We know this is a time of epochal change in the world system. So I think it's so important that we gather here frequently and discuss, share ideas, and think about where this is all going. And I see many familiar faces here, and I deeply appreciate those who have been making the time every week. And I think, I hope you've been getting as much out of it as I have. And we've had quite a string of great speakers and another one today. So we welcome Thomas Graham today. He's Distinguished Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's co-founder of the Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies program at Yale, where he's taught for the last decade. He was also Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Russia on the National Security Council staff from 2004 to 2007, and Director for Russian Affairs on the staff between 2002 and 2004. So we're thrilled to have him here. I got to hear him speak maybe 6 weeks ago at a Russia conference, and was completely fascinated by his perspective. So I'm so glad he could come to the Watson Institute and share ideas with us. Tom.
Great, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be with you today, and thank you for inviting me to the Watson Institute. I've heard about it for many, many years. It's my first actual visit to the Institute, so thank you very much. So in my open remarks, I want to touch upon four questions. What is the nature of this conflict from Putin's standpoint? Why now and not sometime earlier? Where do things stand right now? And how is this going to end? So on the nature of the conflict, I think before Western and American audiences, it's always important to stress that from the Russian standpoint, this isn't simply about Ukraine. This really is about European security architecture and a desire on the part of Russia to revise the post-Cold War settlement of the 1990s that they believe was imposed upon them at a time of tremendous weakness. And they've watched over the past 2.5 decades the extension of Euro-Atlantic institutions, particularly NATO, which we remember was formed to contain the Soviet Union, that is Russia, and the European Union, which is a community of nations to which Russia can really never aspire to join. And these institutions have expanded eastward over the past 2.5 years towards Russia's borders. And this has had two consequences that pose, from the Russian standpoint, something of a psychological and a strategic threat. On the psychological side, it's important to remember that Russia's sense of itself as a great power is intimately connected with Europe. And after all, Russia demonstrated its prowess as a great power on the great battlefields of Europe over the past 200 to 300 years at the grand diplomatic conferences. Strategically, this eastward expansion, particularly of NATO, has narrowed consistently over time strategic depth, or the buffer zones that Russia historically has considered critical to its own security. And this is something that goes back more than 200 to 300 years. So Russia sees these things as a threat. And if you look at the draft documents, or the draft treaties that Russia released in December of last year, one is a bilateral treaty with the United States, the other a bilateral treaty with NATO, Ukraine hardly figures in those two treaties. What Russia is looking for are three things that Putin stressed in December, January, and February, right up to the beginning of the actual military conflict. That is, Russia wanted no further expansion of NATO eastward. It wanted an agreement not to deploy what they call certain strike weapons on the territory of new members of NATO that were capable of hitting Russian territory. And most important, they wanted NATO to withdraw its infrastructure back to the lines that it was at in 1997. That is the year in which the NATO-Russia Founding Act was signed, and 2 years before the first actual expansion of NATO eastward. Now, it's also clear that this is about Ukraine. Ukraine is, in fact, the center all these concerns about NATO expansion eastward. And when Putin launched the special military operation, he underscored 2 points, 2 goals: the demilitarization of Ukraine and the denazification of Ukraine. I think which all of us interpreted as regime change. I think it's also worth pointing out that for Putin himself, Ukraine is important beyond simply the question of European security architecture. If you read his document from June of last year, it's clear that he considers Ukraine to be an integral part of Russia, more Russian than anything else, and that Ukraine, in many ways, is a made-up nation. Something created in the West, not something that has grown organically out of developments in East Central Europe or Eurasia. So the conflict is about European security architecture, and that means that even if we resolve this narrow Ukraine crisis sometime in the near future, the problem that we have with Russia is going to continue. Now, why now? Because his concerns about European security architecture have been around for many, many years. In fact, they've been around from the moment the Soviet Union broke up in 1991. I like to think of this in terms of three baskets of developments: 2 that intensified the threat from the Russian standpoint, and 1 set of developments that provided the opportunity. So if we look at the threats, first, there's the set of threats that were emerging from Ukraine itself. The politics of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky over the past year and a half. A clear effort to clamp down on the pro-Russian forces inside Ukraine itself. He went after some big business people, oligarchs, one in particular, Viktor Medvedchuk, who had served previously in the Ukrainian government, but most importantly had a personal relationship to Russian President Putin. Zelensky also went after media, particularly television stations, that broadcast in Russian and positions that were close to those of the Russian government. The second thing that Zelensky did that was of concern to the Kremlin was to make a concerted effort to put pressure on NATO to make good on its promise at the Bucharest summit of 2008 that Ukraine would eventually become a member of NATO. That is, he wanted to put Ukraine on a fast track into NATO membership. And third is that Zelensky, as one of his programs, founded what he called the Crimean Platform. This was an effort to bring together particularly European states and others to focus attention on the status of Crimea, to raise the international profile of Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014, and hope that that would lead to further pressure on Russia to consider sometime in the distant future, I would imagine, the return of Crimea to Ukraine. So there were things happening inside Ukraine that were undermining the Russian position from the Kremlin standpoint. The second set of developments concern the relationship between NATO and Ukraine. In 2020, NATO granted Ukraine something that was called an Enhanced Opportunities Partnership. This led to closer ties between individual NATO countries and Ukraine. Greater supply of weapons, training exercises, joint military exercises, both on land and in the Black Sea. The United States played a particularly large role in these efforts, and the United States was also using this as an opportunity to conduct more active strategic reconnaissance flights over Ukrainian territory close to the Russian border. Again, something that the Kremlin found very disturbing. So if up until, say, 2019, 2020, Russia was concerned about Ukraine joining NATO, from 2020 onward, it was concerned about NATO entering Ukraine. So that in many ways, Ukraine became a de facto member of NATO from the Russian standpoint. Now the set of opportunities. This really comes from the situation in the West. We had a new president in the United States, a president who made clear, if you read the initial statements and security documents that were released about this time last year, they didn't want to spend a lot of time dealing with Russia. China was the clear priority. And you add on top of that a very chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan in August of last year, and a sense in the Kremlin that this was a president that wasn't going to do a lot to push back against whatever Russia might want to do in and around Ukraine. You add to that the situation in Germany. Merkel was going to step down. It's clear you were going to get a new coalition government. The coalition government that did emerge was something of a novelty in German politics, a three-party coalition. It was clear that this was a coalition that wanted to focus largely on domestic affairs. Foreign policy was not at the top of the list by any stretch of the imagination. And that was going to provide a further opportunity for Russia to meddle in ways and not get a severe reaction, not from the Germans. Third was the French presidential elections, and the assumption that this would occupy the attention of French President Macron for some time, and also focus him on domestic politics as opposed to foreign policy. You add to that the Europeans' failure to fill the gas storage facilities adequately last summer, so that we had an energy crisis that emerged in the fall and into the winter of last year, something that obviously played into Russia's hands, given the great reliance of Europe, particularly Germany and countries east of Germany, on Russian gas. And then finally, two factors. The sense that Zelensky was not a popular president in Ukraine, and certainly was true if you looked at the polls, and that Ukrainian politics was a series of internecine struggles between Zelensky, the former President Petroshenko, and others. So an unpopular president, and then finally a Russian military that Putin himself had set about to modernize over the past 10 years, a military that had performed from the Russian standpoint almost flawlessly in Crimea in 2014, had demonstrated tremendous capability in the incursion in Syria in 2015, and had been exercised quite actively over the past decade, and provided with a lot of modern equipment. So a military that was in peak form and capable of carrying out fairly complicated military operations. Now, as we all know, Putin miscalculated almost across the board. The Ukrainians rallied around President Zelensky. Zelensky turned out to be a very charismatic military leader. The resistance turned out to be much stiffer than the Kremlin had anticipated. And certainly the Kremlin wasn't being greeted like liberators as the troops moved across the border towards Kiev, the way that Putin had anticipated when he launched this operation. Second, the response of the West was much more rapid and of greater scale than Putin had anticipated. The sanctions were levied fairly early on. To the surprise of people in Washington, the Europeans were actually out in front, pushing the administration to levy sanctions, more heavier sanctions more rapidly than the administration itself had wanted to do. That came as a surprise. Particularly surprising was the reaction of Germany, which fairly early on suspended the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, decided that it needed to spend more on defense, and that it was going to support Ukraine in a significant fashion. So the sanctions, both the economic and other sanctions, were stiffer and more severe than Putin had anticipated. And finally, the Russian military turned out not to be all that good at the end of the day. It ran into logistics problems from the very beginning. We all remember seeing those long lines of military equipment on the road outside of Kiev, not moving at all, providing easy targets for ambush by the Ukrainians. And to the extent that Putin didn't get to deliver his Victory Day speech in Kiev, and probably won't, he thought he would be there in 3 or 4 days, that you would have regime change. None of that happened. And in fact, Russia, at the end of the day, decided that it was going to have to withdraw and enter the second phase. Plan B, as they call it. But if you listen to the Russian media, all this is going according to plan. That phase, the first phase has been successfully completed in and around Kiev, and now they're working on the second phase in and around the Donbass. So where are we now? As I've already indicated, we are moving towards the Donbass region. This is the focus of the immediate Russian military campaign. In a sense, it's Putin returning to what he announced as the original goals of the campaign way back on February 23rd and February 24th, that Russia was going in to protect the independence of these states that they had recognized 48 hours before, or 24 hours before, against an imminent attack by the Ukrainian forces to protect them from acts of genocide and so forth. It's also clear that part of this operation includes building a land bridge between the Donbass region that is occupied by Russia at this point and Crimea. That's why Mariupol, which has been under siege for the past 8 or 9 weeks and has fallen or not fallen, depending on how you define having fallen. But military operations are still continuing in and around Mariupol. A senior Russian military officer also suggested that the plan included extending a corridor from Crimea through Odessa to a separatist region in Moldova, Transnistria, where there are about 1,500 Russian troops located. Whether that's indeed part of the plan or not, we don't know, but we have seen some actions in Transnistria over the past few days, which suggests that someone's trying to make an effort to draw this into the conflict. We've seen Ukraine shift its forces for a major battle in the Donbass, and we've also seen over the past couple of weeks is a much intensified effort by the United States and its NATO allies to supply the types of weaponry that the Ukrainians need in order to push back against what is going to be a major conventional operation. Now, what's interesting is the change in views on the part of the West. My sense from having talked to people in Washington is we share the same assessment of the Russian military and the Ukrainian resistance that Putin did. And we thought that this would be a fairly major operation, tremendous success at the very beginning. And the types of weapons that we provided the Ukrainians at that time, the javelins and the stingers, are great for insurgent warfare. But we hadn't provided them the types of weapons you need for large conventional battle, the heavy artillery, some aircraft, tanks, and so forth. And that is what is being rushed into Ukraine right now as the nature of the conflict shifts in the eyes of the West. We've also seen an escalation in the rhetoric on the part of the United States in particular, laying out a goal somewhat diffuse. It's hard to know exactly what it means, but the goal now is to degrade the Russian military to the extent that it cannot, that it would not be able to conduct another type of operation similar to the one it's conducting in Ukraine anytime in the near future. Now, I draw a few conclusions from where we are at this point. First, it's clear that there's no near-term political settlement to this conflict. There was some dialogue between the Ukrainians and the Russians. That's ongoing as far is my understanding. But it didn't appear to be serious on the part of the Russians. If you look at the terms that the Russians were presenting to the Ukrainians, basically there were terms of surrender, capitulation, something that the Ukrainians weren't prepared to entertain seriously, and still aren't. So I don't see negotiations at this point, in part because both sides believe they can gain on the battlefield what they need, and there's no real need to negotiate at this point. The second thing I think to remember is that this is going to be a prolonged conflict. The original, I think, assessment in the West and in Russia was that there was to be a fairly short operation. I think Xi Jinping in Beijing also shared that and was hoping for a short military operation. It would have made his life a lot easier. But I think now we realize that this is more likely to be prolonged than it is to be short. In part because this is an existential conflict for the various parties. Certainly for the Ukrainians, this is about their independence and sovereignty, freedom as a nation. It may not be existential for the Russians, even though the Russians say that, but it's certainly existential for Putin, who has bet his political fate on being able to produce something that he can call a success in Ukraine. And I would argue that if it's not existential for the United States and Europe, we certainly have framed this in a way. The president talks about this battle between freedom and autocracy, democracy and autocracy, that it's hard to see how the United States can accept anything less than a failure on the part of Russia at this point. I think because it's going to be prolonged, because there's no negotiated settlement on the horizon, and this would be my third point in this regard, is that there's a tremendous risk of escalation. The longer this conflict goes on, the greater the risk that it's going to spread, and that different types and more devastating weapons are going to be used. I see the escalation coming from two possible scenarios. One is if the Russians do poorly, if they don't make much progress in the Donbass. So the Ukrainian resistance turns out to be as stiff in the Donbass as it was in and around Kiev. At that point, I think the Russians consider, or Putin considers, the use of weapons of mass destruction. Chemical weapons, most likely, in part because the Russians have used these before in combat situations in Syria, for example, over the past several years. But certainly we can't rule out categorically the use of nuclear weapons. Certainly Putin himself has been saber rattling over the past several weeks, and even yesterday made another statement about warning the West against getting too involved in this conflict on the Ukrainian side, and intimating that Russia had means of responding quickly and with devastating force. Clearly had in mind nuclear weapons. The second way we get escalation is if Russia decides finally to go after the convoys that are carrying the weaponry into Ukraine at this point, something that, strangely enough, they've avoided doing in a serious way so far. It is much easier to go after those go after those weapons, not when they're in convoys traveling into Ukraine. It's much easier to go after them at the transshipment points where they're gathered together for shipment into Ukraine. All those lie in NATO territory, particularly in Poland. And I don't think we can rule out over the next several weeks or months possible strikes against those transshipment centers in Poland, elsewhere. That's NATO territory. The President of the United States has promised that we will defend every inch of NATO territory. There is an Article 5 guarantee, and so this is a serious risk of escalation. And then finally, something that we had thought we would see early on, but haven't so far, is some sort of significant cyber attack against a NATO country, or particularly the United States. A massive attack against some element of critical infrastructure, perhaps financial sector, in a sense, a symmetric response to what the United States and NATO countries are trying to do to Russia on the economic side. And all of this would require some sort of more forceful response on the part of the United States, given the public and congressional pressure that would mount after a significant cyber attack. Now, I also think that it is possible that we'll see the escalation on the Western side, on the American side. Let's get back to a point that I raised just a little while ago. If Russia is succeeding, the United States finds itself in a very difficult circumstance, given the President's rhetoric, the way we frame this issue. And I think the question you would have to ask in Washington is, how far are we prepared to go in order to prevent Russia from succeeding in Ukraine? You've seen an increase in the rhetoric. As I've said, over the past 24 to 48 hours, we are providing types of weapons that we wouldn't have considered some time ago. The question, I think the most serious question that has to be addressed is the question of boots on the ground. The President has ruled that out repeatedly over the past several months, but as the consequences of this conflict become clearer, the stakes become clearer, is that something that the President is going to be able to stick to? Is that something that won't be resisted by significant members of the U.S. Congress and the public? I don't know the answer to that question, but I think it's something that we need to bear in mind. And in fact, I think it's something that we ought to have a significant public debate about, so that however we move in this regard, the administration has sufficient public support. Now, finally, just a few words on how does it end. The short answer is, I don't know. I certainly don't know when it's going to end, but this is a conflict that could last for, as I said, for several months. It could last in terms of years. I don't think you're going to have a near-term political settlement. So how do we see this winding down? I think there are two ways. Neither one of them pretty. One is exhaustion. After all, this has become in some ways a war of attrition. As the two sides are exhausted, they simply will either move towards negotiation or simply stop fighting. The other possibility is a military stalemate, which is somewhat different from exhaustion. It comes from the recognition that there's no, in both Kiev and Moscow, that there's no sort of military way to break open this conflict, to reach your ends, and therefore it is time either to wind down the conflict or to move towards serious negotiations. If we don't get serious negotiations, we could get a frozen conflict, as we've seen in many of the conflicts that have erupted in the post-Soviet space over the past 25 or 30 years. If we get a political settlement, I would imagine that it will be something along the lines of Ukrainian neutrality with security guarantees, some recognition of Crimea as part of Russia, and the Donbass goes back to Ukraine. Something that I am persuaded we could have negotiated if we were serious about it before the conflict, but the way things turn out in the real world often is that you have to go through the death and destruction to get a solution that was staring you in the face if you had the political will to pursue it earlier. So let me end on that pleasant note.
Well, Tom, thanks so much. That is a deeply insightful analysis. I'll be going back through my notes really carefully. I invite people to share some questions. If we can keep the questions on the short side, I think that will allow us to get more questions in. So, okay, please, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much. Your analysis is extremely sound and insightful. I have one simple question. Do you think the war is preventable? And what happened now is due to miscommunication, misunderstanding, misconception, and mismanagement from both sides? Perhaps more on the American side?
My sense is that that there was more room for negotiating in January and February if the United States had been prepared to engage in that. That said, I mean, the Russians didn't help the negotiating process by publishing the treaties and throwing a negotiation that is best conducted in private and confidentially into the public domain, which made it very difficult for the United States to respond in a full fashion because of what the public consequences of it would have been. I think the United States should have been prepared to negotiate the issue of NATO expansion now, or at least put it on the table and have a conversation with the Russians about it. The open door policy that we stood behind equivocally is one, I think, a misreading of the NATO treaty, which is not really an open door. The Article 10 of the Founding Act for NATO says that NATO has reserves to itself the right to invite states to join that they believe would enhance the security or make a significant contribution to the purpose of the alliance. That doesn't mean that any European country has a right to join NATO, and many times it's presented that way in public. I think second, it was clear that we weren't going to admit Ukraine anytime in the near future. The United States wasn't prepared to do that, and certainly our significant European allies, the Germans and the French, were not prepared to do that. So I thought that we should have been able to sort of put that on the table and try to work towards a formula that could have satisfied Russian concerns about eastward expansion, maybe not forever, but over a significantly long period, that it wouldn't have been an issue for Putin. For President Putin, forever probably means as long as he is alive. And so I'm sure we could come up with a number that was longer than even he thought he was going to survive. So I think we should have been more active in trying to negotiate that. My colleagues or the contacts in the government say they don't think that Putin was ever serious about negotiating. For what reason, it's not clear. I think we should have been a bit bolder in the way we approached it, and perhaps been able to extend the negotiations for some time. That would have delayed and perhaps even prevented a military conflict from erupting in the past.
Can I two-finger on that,
Yeah,
Tom?
yeah.
Because I think if I read your important article in Politico, where you, I think it was in January, where you elaborated on what a possible solution would look like, and I urge everyone to look at that article. It was extremely well done and got a lot of attention at the time. But I think you said there that the focus is, the burden is on Washington. I mean, it should be a Moscow-Washington deliberation, and if I got you right. But I wonder if European leaders maybe had more wiggle room, more attention. You
Well,
seem to
no,
think.
I think the negotiation. Well, let me put it this way. A significant element of any negotiated solution of this problem has to be a U.S. Russian conversation. This is about European security architecture. And from Moscow's standpoint, the country in the West that has the most weight when it comes to European security architecture is the United States. Certainly they believe that Ukraine is being run by the United States at this point. They think most of our European allies are little more than vassals. And so the country that you need to have a serious conversation with is the United States. That said, it's also clear that the United States has to be in close consultation with its allies. It would have to be in close consultation with the Ukrainians. But I think it's very difficult, if you're going to have serious negotiations, to insist that we won't talk about the Europeans unless the Europeans are in the room. We won't talk about the Ukrainians unless the Ukrainians are in the room. Once you get a meeting at NATO, 30 member countries plus Russia, that's an exchange of views. That's not a serious negotiation. If you move it to the OSCE, that's, what is it now, 54 or 55 countries. But in any event, the same sort of thing. It's an exchange of views, but not a serious negotiation. The United States needed to sit down with the Russians in a bilateral channel, a confidential format, and sort of see what the room was for a diplomatic exit to this problem as it was building over the winter and into the spring. You would take that back, obviously, to the Allies. You would take it back to Ukraine, but you would take it back with at least some sort of package that people could look at and weigh the pluses and the minuses. Final point here, this has to be done confidentially. The problem with the way the diplomacy unfolded, it was all done in public. Yes, they talked behind closed doors, but then they had to go out and talk to the press. Agreements or documents were released to the public. If you're going to have a serious negotiation, people have to make compromises. That's the nature of any negotiation. Each individual element of a compromise, if taken out of context, can be criticized to death. And that's what happens when it's in the public domain. You have to be able to put the whole package together and then present it to the public. You'll still get a lot of criticism, but when people can see how the trade-off plays out, what you get for having given up, what you get for what you have given up on Part B, and so forth, and maybe the whole package makes sense, or each individual element doesn't appear to make sense in isolation. So that's where I come down on it. So I would have had a much broader negotiating effort, but...
You made a great effort, I think. Professor Bartow.
Thank you. So, yeah, I think you made a very cogent argument or describe the situation from one kind of perspective, which I think we've heard more than once also in this forum. And I'm curious whether you would entertain another way of looking at things. So you gave both this sort of deep background of this, that is Russia's frustration with what occurred since the fall of the Soviet Union, and the more immediate reasons for this particular conflict, right? That's the two arguments you made. And I'm wondering if we could think about it differently, that is, had NATO not expanded to include Poland, Lithuania, and so forth, what would things have looked like right now? That is, would Russia have said, well, I mean, the independent countries, we are not going to meddle because they're not members of NATO? Or would the response have been, we still want to recreate either the spheres of influence that the Soviet Union had, or actually what the Russian Empire was? So that's one question. I'm just wondering if you could think about it that way. The second is the question of loss or victory, which is a really interesting one. So we sort of agree that a loss for Russia would be dangerous, right? Because they may respond in ways that would endanger world security. And we also, I think, would agree that a victory for Russia is dangerous because Russia has been victorious in all the previous attempts to expand, and that's one reason why it thought it could go into Ukraine. That's what you were explaining yourself. So what then, what do we want more? Victory or defeat? And your response is negotiation, which I think is, I totally agree with that, but the way you presented it now was basically that the United States and Russia would agree on what would happen to Ukraine. And that is precisely the kind of scenario that we have seen in history. That is that for the benefit of peace, you would go over the people that you are willing to sacrifice. And what kind of precedent would that create, considering that what Russia did was break international law and conduct what is internationally accepted an illegal war, a war of aggression? Wouldn't that mean that you do that, and then the person, the country that you did it to, then its fate would be negotiated over its head by those, or one party would be the party that broke all the rules of the game?
Okay, two very good questions. First, on the question of if we hadn't expanded NATO, I think Russia still would have wanted a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. How far it would go is a matter of speculation at this point, but it would have wanted some influence on the countries in that region. Certainly Ukraine, Belarus, whether it would also be the Baltic states and Poland is something that we can debate. I was not opposed to NATO expansion. I think that we handled some of it in ways that made it more threatening to Russia than it needed to be. And there are two aspects to that. I thought that we never gave enough or put enough effort into these joint fora that we created with the Russians. Certainly the initial one we created in 1997, this Permanent Joint Commission, where NATO sat down with Russia to discuss various issues. But the one that I'm most familiar with is the one that we set up in 2002, which was the NATO-Russia Council, where NATO countries and Russia were supposed to sit down in their national positions, not as members of the alliance plus Russia, and discuss a limited range of issues, as search and rescue, some missile defense, a few other things along those lines, looking for sort of joint assessments and areas where we could perhaps have joint efforts. The United States, from the very beginning, I think, handled that in a way that was was off-putting for the Russians, and that is, before any meeting of the NATO-Russia Council, we had insisted that NATO would sit down and decide on a unified position, which each country was then obliged to defend within the NATO-Russia Council. Now, the Poles and the Balts also wanted it that way, but we turned this into what the previous Joint Committee had been, and it hadn't worked because Russia didn't feel that it was being treated as an equal the way it had been promised. Now, there was always a risk in doing that. My view, looking at this in 2002, 2003, was that the asymmetry in power between the United States and Russia was so great at that point that we could have run the risk that Russia would not have operated within that council in good faith. They had operated in good faith. We could have tried to expand it and see how far we could push the cooperation. If they had acted in bad faith, I think it would be very easy for the United States to recoup whatever it lost in fairly good in good order, again, given the asymmetry in power. So then I think finally we handled 2008 and the promises to Ukraine and Georgia improperly. It was clear that there was significant resistance within NATO to offering them membership action plans at that point. And the formula we came up with was, as everybody recognizes now, was the worst of all possible worlds, saying that someday they will become part of NATO. So we disappointed the Ukrainians and the Georgians, and we raised the concerns on the Russian side. So I think we could have handled it in a different way, and perhaps have come to a somewhat more constructive relationship between NATO and Russia over the past 30 years. The second question. What I was discussing initially was a negotiation before the conflict broke out. And there, as I said, I think a U.S. Russia channel was critical. We would have been in close consultation with the Ukrainians. We would have been in close consultations with the Russians. That doesn't preclude other types of conversations as well, but I think that channel was essential to making any progress. Any sort of deal or agreement we would reach with the Russians clearly had to be approved by the Ukrainians, would have to have been acceptable to our European partners as well. But I think it's easier to sell something if you got a whole package than, as I said, it's trying to sell individual parts along the way. Now that the conflict is broken out, we're in a somewhat different situation, right? And the question is, what we could settle on that would be adequate for our purposes, that the Russians would agree to, and that the Ukrainians would agree to as well. A couple of points here. First, something that we generally haven't recognized in the West or in the United States in our public debate is that while our interests overlap to a very great degree with Ukrainians, there's not a perfect overlap in those interests. And we have to decide what our interests in fact are. The public rhetoric to this point, and I think Secretary Blinken said it yesterday, is whatever the Ukrainians want, we're prepared to support. I step back and say, really? We might not want to push the Russians as far as the Ukrainians would be prepared to push the Russians if they could, in part because of the consequences on the nuclear side, in part because we have global responsibilities and are not concerned simply about Ukrainian dependence and sovereignty at this point. Second, again, it's harder to define. I think we know what success would look on the Russian part. What would failure look like on the Russian part? Where I think our interests lie is pushing the Russians back so that the military operation does not gain them any territory in Ukraine. So back to the lines that were drawn on February 23rd. Russia's still in control of Crimea, and Russia's still in control of a part of the Donbass region. Whether the Russians could present that as a victory. I don't know. But if you threw into the mix no Ukrainian membership in NATO, Putin and his propaganda machine ought to be able to make something of a victory out of that. And if you throw in the Azov regiment as well, disbanded, then he can claim that he denazified part of the Ukrainian military. So I think there are ways of doing this that are less than a capitulation on the part of the Russians, something that's acceptable for them, works for us. It may not be all that Ukraine wants at this point, but it's certainly a much better situation than they will be in otherwise, and would put an end to the devastation that's being done to the country and will continue to be done to the country as long as this conflict continues.
Okay, folks, we've got just about 10 minutes left, so if you permit, we'll go through kind of a speed round, which here I would like to just invite anybody who has a question to rather quickly voice their question, and then
very short answers, so just yes or no?
No. What I mean is we'll have all 3 or 4 questions, and then we'll give you a chance to just close the deal, as it were, and give us your final thoughts on whatever you're able to answer quickly. But okay, so Michael, quickly if you can. Sorry.
I can be quick. So, Dr. Graham, this is such a fantastic presentation. And here's the question. Could you make an account for what the Ukrainians could have done differently? Not only in terms of averting war, but could you say that the Ukrainians actually maneuvered us into this position where they are now given a greater chance of sovereignty and recovery of their own territories than they could have otherwise been?
Great. A lot of great questions. So, Tom, do your best, but
yeah,
I realize it's a lot to
I like
cover.
this question about the military. Just 2 quick comments. There was a Russian analyst after the invasion who had said that it wouldn't happen, couldn't happen, who said, I was wrong about whether Russia would invade or not because I was right about the consequences. And I couldn't understand how any rational figure could have chosen those consequences, which I think is an apt way of putting it. The second thing is that it really is shocking the extent to which Putin and Washington both exaggerated the capabilities of the Russian military and underestimated the resistance on the Ukrainian part. Our military analysts were very good in saying that this invasion was going to occur, that the Russians were lining up all the forces in order to do this, and then they were totally wrong about what the consequences of this would be. So I take with a grain of salt anything that I hear from a military analyst at this point as how this conflict is going. We totally misread it. That is the real intelligence failure, that we got right the date of the invasion was more through because we had access to certain information that was fairly definitive. But we missed totally what the capabilities of the Russian military are. And if I were sitting in Washington now, I would having my intelligence community go back and say, what is it that we missed? How did we get this as wrong as we did?
We also missed, in some sense, the capabilities of the people we've been arming.
Yeah, no, absolutely. As I said, the point I made, we were supplying them with weapons for an insurgency because we didn't believe that they would be capable of pushing back the way they had. And if we had, we would have provided them with a different set of military equipment. So there are a lot of questions here that have to be answered.
That and the whole of Afghanistan,
Yeah.
you couldn't believe that somebody would do this.
Yep. We also we also missed the end game, right? Because we thought the Afghan government would, as long as we had troops on the ground, the Afghan government would hold up. They deserted the country 2 weeks before we left.
Fighting the last war.
Just a lot of questions here. To answer your question, I don't think the Russians actually gained by having all of Donbass. But But the flip side of that is, would Ukraine be better off without the occupied areas of the Donbass at this point? Because the Donbass, if they take it for themselves, it does deprive them of some leverage that they would have had in internal Ukrainian politics. By the same token, if you're sitting in Kiev, without those occupied areas of the Donbass, you have a greater chance of developing the type of consensus you need to build a strong and efficient state and nation. Germany, I think that Russians are reconsidering their vision of Germany at this point. That relationship, though, has soured over the past 8 years. In any event, the steps that the coalition government has taken, I think, are a surprise for the Russians, but again, an indication of how radically things have changed because of a clear, unprovoked aggression on the part of the Russians. And your question, which I wish I knew the answer to, but to some extent, you can see that playing out. That the Ukrainians, in fact, pushing us farther than we wanted to go for various reasons. I mean, Zelensky has really been critical in that regard. He's turned out to be a very able war leader. He's great. He's great media. He is straightforward in his comments. Always asking for a little bit more. You have that on top of sort of the very valiant resistance by the Ukrainians, and it's a great story, right? And so you've got the Secretary of State of the United States basically saying in public, we're prepared to provide the Ukrainians with what they need to accomplish whatever they want to accomplish, which may be a noble sort of thought, but is not really what you're supposed to do when you're in a national security position. We need to define quite clearly what our interests are. We need to convey that to the Ukrainians. As I said, there's going to be a tremendous overlap, but it's not 100%. And we ought to be conveying, if that's indeed what we think, we ought to be conveying that to the Ukrainians right now, something that they should factor in to what they're doing and what they hope to accomplish.
Well, thank you so much, Tom. Please join me in thanking our guests.